It's time to start this CULTIVATE webinar. It's an event that's part of Southampton University's Science and Engineering Festival. So welcome to you all. It is time for us to take this whiteboard down now and to introduce ourselves. Welcome to you all. I'm Lucy Green. I'm a developmental physiologist at the University of Southampton, and my co-hosts today are Dr Mark Chapman, a plant biologist. Hi Mark. And Dr Kath Woods-Townsend, who is a health science educator. Hi Kath.
Hi.
I hope you can all see us all okay, and you can choose how you view us, either as multiple presenters or just the person who's doing the talking like me right now, by using a little icon at the top right hand corner of your screen, so you can switch between those options. Kath.
Can see it's really great to have you all on this call, and we can see your names, but actually it would be really helpful to know roughly what age you are. So a poll has just come on screen here. If you could just click on it to give us an idea of what age you all are, that would be great. And we'll just leave that up for a couple more seconds and then it will get taken down. That's really helpful. Thank you. We've got a nice kind of spread of people attending, and we're still expecting people to kind of join us as we go through, I expect, as well. Okay, so on that whiteboard, which we just had up as you were all joining, you really helpfully added some words for us about what you thought when we say the word climate change. And there were some really kind of big, scary words on there. So we've got, just trying to have them here now. So lots about kind of changing weather patterns, loss of animals, loss of insects, rising sea levels. So some really kind of quite dramatic and scary consequences of climate change. And what the plan for this hour is to hear from us each individually about the work that we do in the world of plants, in the world of health, and with young people, and to really kind of get you thinking and asking questions about how all those areas join up together, how they all link together, what those connections are between climate change, plants, and our health. So really thinking about the big picture of climate change, in the hope that actually it might influence you and what you go on and choose to do. Over to you, Mark.
All right, thanks. So at any point you can ask us a question. If you look in the bottom right hand side of the screen, there's a little pink patch, and next to that there should be a speech bubble, and there'll be a chat function that opens up when you click that, and at any point you can post a question. So you can either ask something quite general at any point, or if one of us mentions something that makes you think of a really important question you'd love to have answered, please just write it in whenever you want to. If we do end up getting dozens and dozens of questions, then what we'll do is we'll make a note of some of those if we don't have time to answer them immediately, and we'll be able to keep the chat going after the session. So we can answer your questions after the session is done.
We hear more and more about the catastrophic impacts of climate change. Kath just outlined a few, you know, the rising temperatures, the devastation of landscape through floods or drought, and the loss of species. It feels apocalyptic, doesn't it? Some of the words you put up, as I said, reflected that really, and it's influenced by the things that we do. Just look at this.
So you'll see here, there's a map of the world, and all of the little dots on it indicate some sort of hazard or extreme weather event. 11% of the world's population is currently vulnerable to climate change impacts, and this includes things like sea level rise, droughts, floods, heat waves, and other extreme weather events. So everywhere there's a red dot, one of these extreme events has been caused by something that humans have been doing, whereas the blue dots, they indicate where it's a more natural phenomenon. So you can see that over the last few years, there's been a lot of events that have actually been down to the things that we have done.
Thanks, Mark. We also know that there are lots of things. I'm just going to change the slide. There are lots of health problems in the world that we live in. we're right in the middle of a big health crisis with COVID-19. It's an infectious disease, but there are lots, of course, other diseases which people live with and sadly die from too, which are non-communicable diseases. And actually, they're responsible for around 70% of the deaths worldwide. Well, we spend a lot of time, don't we, thinking about ways to make us and members of our societies more healthy. So at the heart of today's webinar is thinking about the things that we do, which are affecting global climate, but also affecting our health right from the very earliest moments of development until we're old. You know, we're quite used to thinking about what we can do to make ourselves more healthy: exercise, diet, and less stress. We'll get on to a bit more of that in a minute. And we hear lots about the things that we do to our environment that contribute to climate change. And one of those things is pollution.
So, for example, we hear a lot about carbon dioxide. And this graphic is really showing the levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And as of 2018, the level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is the highest it's been in 3 million years. This clip just showed you, as it ran through, how those levels have changed over the years. And round about here, you've got the Industrial Revolution in the kind of late 1700s, and you can just see the impact that that's had on the levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, that kind of really exponential growth in carbon dioxide. It's not just carbon dioxide. There are a few of these greenhouse gases, and we call them greenhouse gases because they act by trapping warm air in our atmosphere, which warms us up. This slide here from the data shows us that here in dark green, as an example, 10% of all global greenhouse gas emissions from human activity is caused by deforestation and burning of forests. And just this act alone, just the act of cutting down trees and burning the wood, just that act alone results in as much carbon dioxide as all the cars and trucks on the planet, which is shown here in orange. We can't just stop producing greenhouse gases overnight. We need power and trucks and cars, etc. But we can really have a think about how much CO2 we're releasing into the atmosphere through cutting down forests and for fossil fuels. Oh, and sorry, and the fossil fuels here is in pink. So it's really about having a look at how we're producing these greenhouse gases and seeing what areas we can actually have an impact on and where we can make choices to start reducing how much greenhouse gases are being released into the atmosphere.
And so here we're starting to realize that the things that we do to the environment can also affect our bodies. And clearly some of the things we do for the sake of our bodies are going to affect the environment as well. So our plan today is to plant a seed, a metaphoric seed, not a real seed. The idea being that edible plants may hold a vital place in our health and in our climate. So first of all, we're going to do a little bit of myth busting about what makes you healthy. And at any point, don't forget, if you have a question, just write it into the chat. And we've got a couple of people behind the scenes who are keeping a keen eye on things. And anything we can't answer right now or we don't have time to answer, we'll get back to you after the session, okay?
Thanks, Mark. We've had a rough few months in terms of health. The COVID pandemic has really shaken, I suppose, the foundations of the way we feel and think about the health of us and those around us. This webinar isn't directly about COVID, but COVID has made us think. We hear a lot about underlying health conditions. You were at a greater risk of the virus if you already had a weaker heart, had diabetes. These sorts of diseases in themselves, non-communicable diseases, are of epidemic proportions and account for around, 70% of premature deaths worldwide. Well, what is it that makes you healthy? It feels a bit like a wheel of fortune, doesn't it? And where will the wheel stop? What makes you healthy? Oh, I've gone too far. You just have to exercise a bit more, don't you? Eat a bit better, then you'll be all right. But actually what works for some of us doesn't work for others. The effects of these kind of interventions can be quite disappointing. Or is it all down to this green piece here, the genes that you were dealt by your parents? But actually purely genetic causes for these diseases, aside from rare forms, haven't really been identified. And actually the epidemic of these non-communicable diseases has occurred a bit too fast for that. So what then? I wonder whether this red section is one that you've ever considered before. If you can read upside down, you'll read that says your early development. The idea is that actually building a baby is the foundation of your lifelong health. It's not just about a successful birth, but actually it's about the moments from the moment of conception right through to the first 2 years of your life, which actually underpin your risk of disease and your health across the life course, and make you able to respond well, if you like, to the environment that you're born into. So if that's true, then how do you build a good baby, if you like, that's set up for a long and healthy life? Well, it's rather like building a house. And for a house, you need bricks. For a baby, you need nutrients. And you need a way of getting the bricks to the house or the nutrients to the baby. For the baby, that's its circulation in the mum and the placenta and the feet. Now, the baby, the unborn baby, will be using some of those nutrients to metabolize, but it needs some instructions on how to do this. Just like a builder needs instructions from an architectural plan, the baby's got the genome. But if something goes wrong in the transport of the nutrients to the baby, or the transport of the bricks onto the building site, then the baby that you build, or the house that you build, is going to be influenced. For a house, if a wonky house is built, it may impact on how it weathers the hurricane when it hits. And just so, how a baby is grown may influence how it responds to the environment that it's born into. Now, there's lots of science that tells us that the developing baby, the fetus here, shown in this cartoon, can sense and respond to the nutrition and oxygen that comes to it across the placenta from the mum. It's sensing the mum's world, her diet, levels of stress, even responding to lifestyle, and exercise. And the unborn baby can adapt. It might actually decide that, in fact, it needs to change the length of time it's spending in the womb. If things are really harsh, it might think that actually it sounds a better chance to be born a little bit early. Or it can change where it sends the nutrition around its body through its blood vessels, shown in this cartoon here. Or it might actually change what it does with those nutrients when they get to the organs, to the brain, to the heart, to the legs. And this is really important because some of these organs, like the heart and the kidney and the skeletal muscle, grow all the cells that they need for life while they're still in the womb. And, these are organs that will control how the body works for the whole of your life. How you handle sugary foods, how you control your blood pressure, how you keep your heart pumping well for the whole of your life, your health, in other words. And baby, the unborn baby in the womb, starts doing this before it's even put down a placenta. It can do sense environment as an early embryo when it's just really a bundle of cells. The baby's adapting and responding to the environment and making the best prediction of the sort of world it's going to be born into. I suppose it better get it right. Could it be that this is why some bodies are responding better than others to things like COVID at the present time? And, scientists are now thinking more and more about how the unborn baby responds to other things in the mum's environment, like toxins and other pollutants in the atmosphere. and that cause the baby to adapt and might influence its health long term. And of course, these are the very things that are influencing our climate. So the things that we know about already that are good for health seem to start influencing us even during pregnancy. And this is quite worrying because our ability to do the right thing in pregnancy, of course, to alter our diet, perhaps have a better balanced diet by increasing edible plant components in our diet, for example, well, that too is affected by the environment. And I suppose this is probably a good point to hand back over to Mark, actually, Dr. Mark Chapman, who is a plant expert who thinks about this sort of thing quite a lot. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides right there.
So whilst we're just letting Mark get himself set up and ready, thought we'd put some questions that have come in to Lucy as you were doing your slides there.
Brilliant.
So from Oliver, we had a question saying, so can a stressed mother, so if a mother's stressed during pregnancy, can that change the personality or well-being of the child's life?
That's a really, really interesting question. And I think there's been quite a lot of work in terms of stress and raised steroid levels as a response to stress response hormones. And yes, I think it can change the way that the blood flow goes around the body in the unborn baby. People have actually shown that in experiments, and that in itself could have long-term impact. There's some nice work done quite early on in this field in Southampton, actually, where they looked at children who not necessarily whose mums had been stressed specifically, but these children actually were smaller at birth. Now, this is not to say they were growth restricted at birth or small for gestational age, but they were across a normal range of birth weights, smaller. As birth weight decreased slightly, actually these children were slightly more agitated when they came to do a live presentation, rather like what's happening to us three right now. So I think that's some really interesting data. But yeah, thank you.
Oh, very interesting. But how does the fetus detect nutrition? Like, how does that actually work then?
Yeah, so we've got some great theories and then some good plausible answers to this. I mean, I always think that, actually as a physiologist, because I kind of, as a whole systems physiologist, I like to think in terms of, gatekeepers and what is the first port of entry, as the blood comes across the placenta to the fetus, well, it's going to hit the liver first, and you kind of hope that you might find some clues there. Well, I can't offer you anything tangible really in that regard, but the other gatekeeper in the unborn baby is exactly the same thing as in an adult body. You have little chemoreceptors, receptors that can detect oxygen floating around in your blood, and they exist in the unborn baby as well. That system is already operating, and that we do know there is some evidence to suggest that those sensors in your circulation which can detect levels of oxygen might also be able to detect glucose. Now, I think that's fascinating as much as other triggers. There are triggers in common. So that's one idea. Even at the vessels themselves, the cells that line the blood vessels, the endothelial cells, well, of course, they have mechanisms that can respond and detect to changes in hormones and in nutrients as well. So you can imagine that, on a local level, your vessels might be responding to that in the unborn baby. But I suppose one of the things that's really taken off in this field is in down right at the very molecular genetic level in the cell. So this idea that actually your DNA can be marked up by the environment that it's in, and that can be quite a dynamic thing. You're dealt a set of genes by your mum and dad, but actually they can be marked up with little epigenetic marks, insensitive to the world that they're in. So those patterns of what they call this methylation, where you have in your stable sequence of code in your gene, your bases that you find in your DNA, you can have little methylation patterns set up on those, and nutrition is thought to be one of the things that can make those marks.
Fascinating. That sounds really complicated and like there's a lot of work that goes into that.
Yeah, a lot of work.
But so that's really interesting. So then what's more important, nature or nurture?
Well, more important in terms of understanding why we're in such a pickle globally and non-communicable diseases, and I suppose it comes back to that wheel of fortune that I was showing. You know, the fact that, you know, a lot of hope was pinned on sequencing the human genome and in those massive projects, which are fantastic. And in fact, you know, now there's the 100,000 genome project, where lots of rare blips and glitches have been linked to diseases, and is a fantastic resource in terms of curing that. But as I said at the beginning, I think no single gene seems to be held accountable for it. So on a pure inheritance basis, I think, you know, it doesn't necessarily hold all the answers. So I think actually the role of the environment, right from those earliest stages, right from the moment of conception, and possibly even before, in setting up in that preconception period, is incredibly important in marking you up, if you like, for how you're going to develop and therefore thrive later on. I mean, it's an interesting case in point, you know, when you think about twins, of course, and you know, that they come from a very, you know, identical genetic background, and yet actually there is still scope for them to be different in terms of their susceptibility to diseases, because of course they have different exposures, and particularly, I suppose, actually in those first 2 years of life when the body is still developing, and that's still really thought to be one of the most influential periods in development in terms of your lifelong health.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I would just encourage everyone to just keep asking questions as we're going along. Just put them into the chat box and we will endeavour to answer as many as possible. But if we miss a few, we'll come back to you after the end of this session. Okay, so Mark, are you ready to go?
Yep, ready to go.
Okay.
So what do we need to get from our diets? Well, we probably know that we need protein, we need vitamins, and we need minerals. And actually meat is full of a lot of these things. The problem with meat is that it's generally thought to be bad for releasing CO2 and methane into the environment. And it also needs these massive spaces where you can have thousands and thousands of cows on a ranch or something like that. And the only way to generate this space is through deforestation. So there's lots of negative impacts concerned with having a lot of meat in our diets and being able to grow all these cows and various other animals as well. So let's look at plants and see how they can be kind of substituted for the meat that we eat. So let's talk about protein first of all. So why do we need protein? Well, some protein we use directly. So we take it in and it gets incorporated into our bodies as a protein. Protein is very high in nitrogen, so another thing that happens is that proteins are broken down and the nitrogen is used in other parts of our bodies. And in fact, almost everything else in our body, in terms of our cells, has some amount of nitrogen in it. So protein is really important in terms of the nitrogen that it contains. Now, you may or may not know that the air is 78% nitrogen. So it seems intuitive, therefore, that plants can maybe take this nitrogen in, they can make protein, and then we consume the plants. But it doesn't work simply like that. Most plants can't take in nitrogen from the atmosphere. But peas and beans are in a plant family where they've actually evolved the ability to use atmospheric nitrogen. And they've got this really cool little system set up. So in the roots of peas and beans, there's these specialized bacteria. And they live in these kind of little blobs almost, and they're called nodules. And if you're growing peas and beans in your garden, don't dig them up now, but at the end of the season, dig them up and have a look, and you'll see these kind of blobs on the roots. They might only be a few millimeters big, but they'll be fairly obvious. The bacteria live inside those nodules. They take in the nitrogen from the air and they convert it to ammonia. And ammonia can be used directly by the plant. So the plant can take in or can use all this nitrogen, even though it can't take it directly from the air. So peas and beans are pretty super in that respect. And fertilizers that we have to apply to all of our crops are very high in nitrogen. And it's very expensive, and it's generally quite bad for the environment to generate all these fertilizers. So growing peas and beans has another positive effect, that you don't need to use as much in the way of fertilizers if you're growing peas and beans. What else do we need in our diets? Well, vitamins and minerals come in all shapes and sizes, and there's dozens and dozens of them. But different plants that we eat have very high amounts of certain different vitamins and minerals. And so you'll see here, I've just grouped three, I've put three groups of things we eat together. So green leafy vegetables, which are very high in some vitamins. We've got tomatoes and peppers and other colourful crops, which are high in vitamins A and C, and these two other things, beta-carotene and lycopene, I'm going to talk about in a second. And then seeds and nuts, B vitamins and vitamin E. So when you're thinking about what to make, or what your parents are going to make, or what you're going to snack on when you're outside, try to remember to have a mixture of these different types of groups so that you're getting a broad spread of all the vitamins and minerals. And here's some of the things that we need these things for. So vitamin A is super important for our bones and our vision. B vitamins that come from the seeds, they help release energy from food, and they also make energy themselves. Vitamin C, obviously very high in oranges, but also in tomatoes and peppers. That's very good for wound healing and for healthy teeth and bones. Vitamins D and K are also super important for our bones. And vitamin E, along with beta-carotene and lycopene that I mentioned earlier, they act as an antioxidant. And so basically, this is a compound that can protect the cells from damage. So when you're thinking about a diet, try and eat a diverse array of plant products. Don't just focus on one or two. Some of the minerals we need, these include magnesium, calcium, potassium, and sodium, and they all help regulate our body's water balance. They're also necessary for our bones, and they're really helpful in stabilizing proteins, and these make up our hair, our teeth, skin, and nails. So a plant-based diet clearly could be very, very healthy, but one of the things to be aware of is that some vitamins are only really found in high quantities in meat. And this goes especially for vitamins B12 and D. So if you're a vegetarian, or especially if you're a vegan, or you're thinking about converting, do pay special attention to what you're eating. And you might want to consider, for example, adding orange juice, which is fortified with vitamin D, to your diet, or you might want to take a vitamin supplement just to make sure you are getting things like B12 and D. So plants do dozens and dozens of other things as well. It's not just about us eating them. We only eat a small fraction of the plants that actually grow in the world. There's about 250,000 species, and we probably eat a couple of thousand maximum. So there's lots of plants out there that have got super benefits for us and for the environment, even though we're not eating them directly. So here's just a few examples of what they do. So obviously when we breathe, we need oxygen. And when we breathe out, this is releasing carbon dioxide. And what we don't want to do is release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere and increase the greenhouse effect. So plants, because they're taking up the CO2, they're doing something called sequestering the carbon. So they're keeping it in, stopping it being released into the environment. So if you imagine deforestation, chopping down trees, clearing woodlands, all of this, because when the trees break down, they're going to release this carbon. All of this is going to be bad for the environment. There's other things as well. So the majority of plants have really strong roots, which actually the plant needs to stabilize itself, but also it helps stabilize the soil and prevent erosion too. And they provide a habitat for many plants and many other animals, birds and insects and things like that. And something that's also important is that plants are really important for our well-being. Because as humans, we like the outdoors, we like to walk around forests, we like to see jungles, we like to see trees and plants and animals. So it shouldn't be overstated that plants are really good for human well-being too. So that kind of brings me on to my next point. So at the moment, we're all aware that there's a coronavirus COVID pandemic going on, and things are starting to get relaxed. But for the last few months, there's been a lot less travel. There's hardly any planes in the sky, and we've been asked to stay home. and not be going trampling around in natural wild areas. So at the moment, there's probably actually a lot of plants that are getting a benefit. And this is certainly in the short term, they're getting a benefit. So when we walk on them or when we just brush up against them a bit too hard, we're going to damage them. So there's a lot of wild plants that are probably enjoying a bit of freedom right now. There's also other plants that can't survive traffic pollutants, so things that come out of car exhausts. And so there may be wild plants that are now expanding their ranges a bit. They're possibly growing more healthy, and they're possibly even producing more flowers or more seeds this year. And so that might mean that there's also insects that are doing well, living on these plants and things like that. So short term, plants are probably having a bit of a respite from our activities. Whether this is going to translate into a long-term change, I think it's hard to say. What I do kind of hope, though, is that we will realise that by removing a lot of pollution and human activity, it will have benefits on the environment. So even though pollution and human activity have to come back, we have to put planes back in the air, we have to have travel, we have to have transport and various things like that. I would hope that there might be some behavioural changes that people can make so that these don't negatively affect the environment so much in the future. And speaking of the future, there's a lot of things we're trying to deal with now. So I'm a plant scientist at the university, and this is one of the things that I'm concerned with. So not only do we have climate change, which we've recently just talked about, but we have an increasing world population going up into sort of 9 billion quite soon, probably. So we're going to need to generate more food. One of the main issues with this, though, is because we've got more humans on the earth, cities are getting larger, so we're running out of land. So we might have to start growing crops on suboptimal land. So we need more food, we've got less land, and the climate is changing. So these three things are coming together to actually cause some serious problems for us to be able to feed ourselves in the future. So as plant scientists, we're coming at this from lots of different angles. And I'm just going to go through some interesting examples of things I've been working on or I've been reading about recently. So firstly, one of the things we can do is simply increase yield. And if you look at this diagram in the bottom left, this is just 3 pictures of a sweet corn plant. So this is how sweet corn grows. It's a grass, but it's a very tall grass. It grows to almost 2 meters tall. And you'll see that they've got these different types of branching where the leaves go. And there was a recent piece of research that actually showed that you could breed through natural variation. You could breed corn with much more acute angled leaves instead of more broad leaves. And that means you can actually increase the density of plants that you can grow on a piece of land. So if you can grow more plants, and you'll be able to get more sweet corn. So this is quite a simple but elegant example of how we can investigate natural variation in crops and try and generate more yield from the crops that we already have. Another thing we might want to do is breed crops that are better at growing on poorer soils. As I've just talked about, cities are growing, and so we might have to grow crops on other land. So this might include land where there's low nutrients, or it might be high in salt, for example, because plants aren't very good at dealing with salt normally. But the diagram on the bottom right here, this shows 2 different varieties of rice that have been treated with salt. The WT on the left means wild type, and this is clearly being negatively affected. It's gone brown, it doesn't look very healthy. But the variety on the right, this is growing super healthy, nice and green. So there's natural variation for tolerance to salt. So simply doing a bit of breeding in the greenhouses by a bunch of plant scientists, we might be able to generate high yielding salt tolerant varieties of rice. And something I've been looking at is drought resilience, because the climate is getting warmer and weather patterns are getting more erratic. And what I'm interested in is whether there's wild species that can be bred with crops so that we can basically cross in the things that we're interested in. So finding out close relatives of some of our crops that have long roots might be an easy way to generate a crop with longer roots. And with longer roots, they can get down further into the soil and they can pull up more water as well. So that's where I'm going to stop here. And I believe we're going to have a whiteboard is going to...
Oh, great stuff. Yeah.
So if you were paying attention to what I was just saying, you'll have been listening about what plants can do for humans. So if you can all think about 1 or 2 examples and just write them down on this whiteboard for me, please. That would be super.
And while you're mulling that over, thanks, Mark. And while you're mulling that over and typing your things onto the whiteboard, we've got some questions that are coming for you, Mark, if you're willing to take them. The first one I think we'll take is came in from Nicole, and she said, sorry, I'm just trying to share my video, so my face is on camera. Can a teenager have a healthy vegan diet? Do they need to take supplements?
I would suggest that most vegans do not need to take supplements if they are getting enough things from their diet. The problem is that vitamins B12 and D in particular are very low in the majority of plants. So if a vegan was to have a diet with a very large amount of 1 or 2 things, they may get enough B12 and D. D is very high in milk. So for vegetarians, it's not so much of an issue, but for vegans, it might be an issue. So just pay attention to, whether this is you or somebody else, Nicole, pay attention to the kind of things that are being eaten. Do a bit of research online as well. You can very easily find out from reputable sources, of course, not just any old website you find. But there are reputable sources. For example, the NHS would have a website, and it would tell you whether you're getting enough B12, D, and possibly some other things as well. So just be aware of what you're doing.
Great. There's a question from Ella. Do you think genetically modified plants will be important in feeding the growing population sustainably?
Yes, I do. So my view is that we've been crossing crops, whether it's different varieties or different species together, for hundreds of years. And there's a lot of crops that we eat today that are combinations of the genomes of various other varieties. So possibly making a high yielding variety, which has also got salt tolerance, might mean that you need to take a high yielding variety that's not salt tolerant and cross it with a salt tolerant one. So we've been breeding these things for hundreds of years, and a lot of what we're eating has already been bred in that respect. But this takes a very long time. It takes lots and lots of crosses. It takes lots and lots of space, because we need to generate hundreds of crops to find hundreds of individuals to find the right combinations. So if we can just find out the salt tolerance gene from a wild tomato and put it into the genome of a cultivated tomato, that just speeds it all up, and you get exactly the same result at the end of it. And there is actually, so traditional genetic modification up until 3 or 4 years ago, one of the risks was that there was these so-called marker genes. So for the scientists to be able to find out whether the gene had gone in, they also had to have a marker gene, whether this was maybe a color change reaction that happens on an agar plate, or whether it's resistance to an antibiotic in the seedling. But there's actually now the potential to do this where you're only modifying the target gene of interest, and you don't have to add in the marker genes. And there's something called CRISPR, C-R-I-S-P-R, if you want to Google it. And I think that's actually potentially the way forward in how we can basically speed up this breeding of crops.
Oh, good, thank you. That's fascinating. And there's a question from Oliver, actually. Is there a problem with overcrowding the soil, which could degrade soil and soil fungi?
If you're talking about overcrowding with too many crops, at some point, yes. At some point, you have too many plants in a unit area, and there won't be enough nitrogen or something else in the soil that the plants need, because they need to take it up. So yes, at some point. And it does also affect things like fungi and bacteria. And actually, there's some quite interesting research recently where different bacteria, these are natural bacteria in the soils, but different bacteria can have positive or negative effects on yield. And quite often, crops need native bacteria, so growing in the same environment where they've always been grown, to have the best kind of yield. Whereas if those crops were moved to a different continent, there may not be the same bacteria in the soils. So there may need to be some manipulation of the bacteria. And certainly having too many crops in one unit area could affect that negatively. That's definitely true. And another thing as well you get is when plants are packed in, they get kind of humid and sweaty under the leaves, and this tends to build up things like bacteria and things and viruses on the leaves. So packing them in too much definitely could have negative effects. So the example I gave about the sweet corn, definitely there needs to be some sort of field trial to make sure that packing them in doesn't have all these negative effects as well.
Thanks, Mark. There's some great comments being left on the whiteboard here. There's some of them are making me smile.
Yeah, it's really busy.
We've got time for a couple more questions, I think. Well, yes. So Fern asked, is aquaponics, hydroponics, a viable solution?
I think it is actually potentially one of the things I've been doing some research about. Aquaponics and hydroponics is quite tricky to scale up to very large amounts. So if you go for a drive through the countryside or a walk, you'll see these massive fields of oilseed rape with the bright yellow flowers. And I don't think you could scale that up with aquaponics and hydroponics. But I've got a colleague who actually works out in Vietnam, and they have a lot of very poor people living in villages. And one of the things they've started doing is trying out aquaponics just in local gardens for most people, so they can have a very small amount of aquaponics themselves. And the signs are very positive. And in actual fact, one of the best or one of the success stories I've heard about is they have a fish tank. So they have fish swimming around in the tank. They have plants on top where the roots are dipping into the tank. And when the dead leaves fall off the plant, they fall into the water, and then the fish eat the dead leaves. So the whole thing is cycling through. It's not just water and crops, it's actually water and crops with fish in there as well. And sometimes they put in their waste from their chickens. They basically throw in some chicken poo, and the fish will eat the chicken poo as well. So not only are they able to keep the plants going through aquaponics, but they're managing to basically have a small pond of fish for them to eat as well.
Yes. I wonder, Gemma, who asked, what can we do at home and in our communities to help humans and the planet? That may answer some of your question, Gemma. I think in the interest of time, we'll just take one final question, which came in from Mark, but the rest of these we may have time to return to at the end. Mark asks, shall we move to cricket stake?
I think that's going to have to come down to personal preference. For me, I have no problem with something like that at all. Insects can be grown on massive scales. Millions and millions of them can be grown in very small amounts. And I don't see any problem with using these very high protein animals to feed us. I think personal preference is going to decide whether everyone's on board or not. Personally, I think it would make a nice supplement to somebody's diet. I don't think it's going to take over.
Mark, thank you very much. I think we'll take down the whiteboard now, which is fantastic input, and that will be captured on the recording of this. And it's time really to bring back Dr. Kath Woods-Townsend. Kath, you're still there. I can see your face, and you're going to share some slides now, I think. And by now, you know, you've hopefully I can see you've been thinking more about the role of that mighty plant and the science that might help it cope with the climate change that's occurring, and why that could be important in solving some of the things that hurt our environment. You know, they're important sources of vitamins, minerals, even protein. So part of a balanced diet, in a way maybe that we can reduce meat consumption too. Good for the environment, good for our bodies. And hopefully you've thought a little bit differently as well about the kind of things that might make you healthy right from the very earliest moments of development, right back to conception, the impact on your lifelong health. We've got to get going really early on in life. And actually there are quite a number of young people on this call. And we do a lot of work with young people in Southampton. Kath.
Thanks. Thank you. So I run a project called LifeLab, which some of you may have heard about. You may have participated in some of our programs. And mainly we work through schools and through the science curriculum. If you could click, Lucy, that would be great. And our purpose is to give young people ways to understand the science behind the health messages, to find out for themselves why the choices we make at a young age are so important for our future health and that of our future families, And these are just some photos to kind of give a flavour of the kind of things that we do when students come and visit us up at LifeLab. Next slide, please. So at the heart of everything we do, if you could click on, Lucy, thanks, is wanting to really give young people like you the chance to have your voices heard. So although what we're doing is providing engagement activities, education activities, actually at the heart of what we're doing is really wanting to give young people the chance to have their voices heard, to be able to contribute to the national discussions happening that are going to shape your futures. And so really to kind of give you an opportunity to feel as if you have power to shape your futures and be in control of the choices that you make. Next slide, please. So I think over the recent years, we've really seen the power of young people, both individually and collectively. So the amazing work that Greta Thunberg does with the climate change activism, and then more recently in the recent months with the campaigns for free school meals over the summer holidays and the Lives Matters protests. And I'm feeling really optimistic that actually as a society we're starting to listen and value young people's voices more. Next slide, please. And here are some examples of heads of states and leaders of political parties who have been holding question time sessions directly with young people in these current strange times. So we had Nicola Sturgeon holding a question time, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, the Finnish Prime Minister holding a press conference, and Keir Starmer, the head of the Labour Party, holding a question time with just 4 young people. And it couldn't be more important at this time for young people to have their voices heard, because whilst you might not be at the highest risk of infection from coronavirus, actually your futures will be heavily impacted from the loss of apprenticeships and jobs, cancellation of exams, the impact of school closures on your education and on mental health. And for the future, across the world, we're going to be recovering from the consequences of this virus for a long time. And you're the next generation who will be guiding us through these times. And so it could be more important for us to really enable you to feel that you have a voice and to be able to use it, and that for us as adults to give you the opportunities to speak up and for us to listen to what you're telling us to do. You have real power to make change, and that's really tough individually on your own as one person at home or one person in your school. It's quite daunting. Next slide, please, Lucy. But you should be really heartened by role models such as Greta and know that collectively you can cause change to happen. You can click on through. So when Greta Thunberg first started, she was a solitary figure doing her climate change school strikes. And within the space of over a year, 18 months, the movement that had happened around her and with her, I think was really phenomenal. So whilst our attention at the moment is rightly focused on this pandemic that we're living through, we actually can't forget about the other issues that are of huge importance to us. So coming back to climate change and thinking about everything that you've heard this afternoon, really want to challenge you to now think about what are you going to do next? What actions can you take away from this that you're going to be able to make changes for yourself?
So that's a lot to think about and some really important stuff to get going in your heads with. While you're mulling it over, should we have any questions for Kath? Have we got a couple of questions in the chat? I can see a couple come through. So Kath, first of all, from Rebecca, as a young person, how can I get involved with campaigns that I'm interested in?
It's a really great question, and I think it's quite hard sometimes to think there's something I'm really passionate about, but where do I go from it? And actually I'd say one of the first ports of call is looking on the internet. There are some really great young people's advocate groups. So there's a group called the I Will campaign who run lots of campaigns for young people and who are always looking out for young people to kind of sign up with them and get involved and really have their voices heard. Bite Back 2030 is the Jamie Oliver group, and again they're currently at the moment, I think it's still live, they've got applications for youth leaders. They want people to come and join them and be the young people's voice and let them know what's actually happening. And more locally, so in Southampton, at Southampton City Council, we have a youth forum that you can apply to be a part of and join up to. And in Hampshire, with Hampshire County Council, we have the Hampshire Youth Parliament. Again, so I think there are lots of opportunities out there. You just need to do a little bit of digging around. And if you find something you're interested in, get involved in it.
Super. That's some really good, interesting information there. There's a question from Ellen. It says, I don't think the government listens to their scientific advisors when making policies. Are they going to listen to us? So I'm sure we can all voice our opinions on the first half of that, but are they going to listen to us and young people in general?
Well, and actually, I think they will. I think we've seen the power of young people in making grown-ups and politicians listen to what you're telling us. You know, you've seen Greta Thunberg on the world stage at the EU climate change meetings and stuff. You know, people are stepping up and wanting to listen to young people. I think this is a really great opportunity to be a young person, a really great time, because actually I think people in charge want to listen to you. And so, you know, I'm kind of passing it back over to you to think, okay, how can I get my voice heard?
Yeah, I think that's really important advice, actually. Yeah. There's a question from Megan and a related one that popped up straight after. So the question is, my mum doesn't want me to be a vegetarian. What can I do? And there's a related question, well, it's more of a statement. My dad loves meat too much to stop eating it.
Yeah, so really great questions. And actually, how do we get people to how do we get people to change behaviours, but also if we're not necessarily in control of what's being cooked in the house or the food that's being bought, how do we influence that? And I would say, if you can do your research, if you can show your mum how you can have a healthy diet as a vegetarian, how you can show her that it's not going to be a lot of extra work for her, volunteer to cook a vegetarian meal once a week for the family, and just take small baby steps to kind of show, you know, I think people sometimes it's an immediate reaction because you think, I haven't got time to think about how I'm going to incorporate this into our busy family life. But if you can work out ways to show your mum how it isn't going to be a hard work for her, I think she'll be much more accepting of it. And for Mark, yes, I think lots of us will be sympathetic with that, because, you know, it's the diet that we're used to. And again, I think it's about putting the arguments to show why it's important to think about what we're eating. And maybe it's not about stopping eating meat altogether, but maybe it's thinking, okay, one day a week, we're just going to try something different. One meal a week, maybe it's just maybe it's just having a vegetarian sandwich for lunch one day a week to start with. It's just those baby steps to see how we can start making changes to our choices.
Great, thank you. Great.
Are there any more questions coming in, Mark, or is that?
I think we've got to the bottom of the list I've got in front of me at the moment. Yeah.
So really, that is all from us. I can see that the time is 2 minutes to the hour, so we need to say goodbye. So it is goodbye from me and from Kath Woods-Townsend. Goodbye. And from Mark Chapman.
Goodbye.
And thank you so much, all of you, for your questions.
It's been great.
If we may ask you to take a few minutes to jot down, I think there might be a whiteboard coming up, jot down on this whiteboard perhaps what you might do next, your pledge, if you like. What might you do to make a difference to your health, to the health of the planet, for yourself perhaps, or for your next generation? And if you would be so kind as well to look in the chat feed, where you'll find a link to a very, very short survey, which would be very grateful if you'd fill in. It won't even take you 5 minutes to complete, and it will give us some valuable feedback on this session. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.